Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. We have a part 2 for you guys today. Our part 1 with Dr. Alan McCubbin was so much fantastic information, and we left that with so many more questions. And different topics we wanted to talk about as well. So we are lucky enough to have him back today. If you guys missed his 2 truths and a lie, we are not going to repeat them here on part 2. So you have to go back and learn, did he break his collarbone and go to his wedding in a cast or not? Go ahead and listen to part 1. We'll link that in the show notes for you guys. But just to reiterate, Dr. Allen, he currently works in the Department of Nutrition and Dietetics and Food at Monash, where he completed his PhD and focused on dietary sodium intake practices for endurance athletes and the implications for health and performance during exercise. And then since then, he has continued to work in defining sodium requirements for endurance athletes and ultra endurance athletes for before, during, and after exercise. We're going to be diving into that before and after conversation today because we covered a bit of during in our first episode. And in 2021, he was awarded the Fellowship of Sports Dietitians Australia for his combined research and education contributions to this profession. So thank you so much, Alan, for coming back for a part 2.
No problem. Pleasure.
Awesome. So we are going to dive into all things kind of pre and post training, and to kind of take it off from where we left off last time. Again, for our listeners, we covered a lot of during training, how to test, measure fluid losses. Is it necessary? What are we looking at? Those kind of markers. But I'd love to dive into the conversation with you, Alan, about how should one kind of prep for maybe a longer duration event, and how would that look different maybe for a very hot event versus an event at altitude, and when should someone start thinking about their fluids, sodium, electrolytes, et cetera, in the days, weeks? What would that look like? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was part of my PhD actually, was to look at this.
Perfect.
So one of the things I wanted to do was understand, well, what are people actually doing at the moment? And then what are the implications, good, bad, or otherwise, of that? So we did actually a survey. It was the easiest thing I've ever done, actually. I think I went from writing the ethics application to having all the data back within a month and a half.
Oh, wow.
Which is unheard of,
Yeah,
which is really lucky.
Impressive.
But yeah, we managed to get responses from, I think, about 350 odd people internationally. Most of them were either Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, UK, or Ireland. There was some others from Asia and South Africa and Europe and other places as well, but the majority were there. And one of the things we wanted to look at was, what are people currently doing in the days leading up to a race? And so we asked people, well, and this is from a sodium perspective, but we'll get to the fluid shortly. And so we asked them, well, what do you do with your sodium in the days leading up? And it was obviously a pretty mixed response, as you would expect, but there was a number of people who deliberately increased the amount of sodium they consume in the days before an event. And I think, just anecdotally and with the athletes that I've worked with, I think the mentality there is almost a little bit like carbohydrate and glycogen. I'm going to lose a lot of sodium during my event, therefore I need to load up on sodium prior to the event. So when I lose that, I haven't lost too much because I've sort of loaded in the days before, and nothing bad's going to happen, so to speak. The problem is that sodium, the way it's balanced within the body and it's stored, is completely different to glycogen. It has no similarities really at all with that. There is some stores of sodium in the body. We still don't really understand the implications of that for healthy, active people. We have a little bit of an understanding for people with maybe high blood pressure or kidney failure or heart failure or something like that. But yeah, when we looked back and asked people, okay, if you are loading up on sodium, how long before an event do you do that? And the most common response was kind of 2 or 3 days before a race. Some people was only sort of the last day, and some people was as much as a week before a race. And part of the reason we wanted to know that is, one of the things I was looking at in my PhD was the relationship between the amount of sodium in your diet and how salty your sweat is, essentially. So we know that if you have a very high salt diet, you pee out a lot more sodium because the body's trying to balance. So you're putting too much in, it just flushes out the extra. And there was some suggestions, and I mentioned this, I think, in the last episode, going back as far as World War II, that this phenomenon happens in sweat as well. And so what we want to understand is, well, what is the time frame that people are loading before a race, and is that period long enough to actually impact on the sweat sodium value? In other words, if you go and do a sweat test for sodium 2 or 3 months before your race, and you get a value of whatever it is, and then people get back the value and go, oh, I need to, I've seen this value, it's really high, I need to load up on sodium in the days before a race. Is that actually going to change their sweat composition on race day, which means that the test you did 2 or 3 months before is meaningless now?
Right.
And I think overall what we saw in that study, we did a 3-day. So we got them to have either a really high sodium diet for 3 days before they came in, a ridiculously low sodium diet, just to look at the two extremes. And they did one trial with their usual diet, which the average just happened to be almost halfway in between those two values, which was really lucky for us. And you did see from the low to the usual diet to the high sodium diet, like a stepwise increase in the sweat sodium concentration between those three levels. The average difference actually wasn't that great, though. It was only about 10 or 12% difference between the highest and the sort of the usual diet, or the lowest and the usual diet. It sort of went up in about 10, 12% kind of increments, which I don't think in the real world would really have that much significance anyway. So I think what I got out of that is, for most people, because there were some individuals that were much bigger differences than that, but the average was sort of around there. So I think what I took out of that was that, that period that people are sort of loading 2 or 3 days before a race is probably not long enough to really substantially alter your sweat sodium composition, concentration. And so it's probably not actually going to be that much of an issue kind of in the real world from that perspective. But I guess the other part of that is, we had to collect, basically for those 3 days that they were doing that before they exercised, we had to collect every drop of urine they produced. So people are walking around with like 2-liter containers. Every time they peed, they had to collect it in these containers. And I mean, this is done, sometimes it's done like a 24-hour urine collection is done in clinical practice.
Wow. Yeah.
Medicine and stuff. But for 3 days in a row, that's a big ask for people.
Wow.
We've now done a study which was sort of 4 and a bit days as well, but
My goodness.
I'll get to that maybe a bit later. But what we saw is kind of what you would expect on a normal day-to-day basis, is that, you consume all this sodium and you lose a lot more sodium in your pee. And, it's probably 95% of what you put in comes back out. And the rest probably comes out in, like, even though they weren't allowed to exercise during that period, they're probably sweating a tiny bit just across the day, just doing their normal daily activities. So, I think, for people that are trying to load up on sodium 2 or 3 days before a race, to some extent, it's kind of worthless, because all that sodium just gets peed out the other end, because your kidneys aren't going to put up with that. We did see a little bit of sort of extra fluid retention in the high sodium diet compared to the usual. So you could argue maybe it's helpful from a hydration perspective to retain a bit more water. But if you look at other practices that people do, you can achieve that within the 4 hours before a race. You don't have to do that for 2 or 3 days before a race.
Okay.
So
interesting.
That's a very long answer to a short question.
Yes.
But I think the question is, you don't have to load up on sodium for days before the event, because the kidneys are just going to flush all of that out anyway. And a short period, 4 hours, is sufficient to achieve basically the same effect.
Okay. So sodium might not be necessary to load. What about fluid loading? Because I know I've seen some studies where I want to say they had the athletes double their fluid intake for 5 days leading up, and they did see an increase, I believe, in blood plasma volume, but I can't recall the name of the study. Is there anything in that arena you could share, and that could have been an old study from my recollection as well?
I think very similar to the sodium, because your kidneys are going to regulate both of those to a large degree. I mean, certainly if you're drinking more, you're going to arrive better hydrated on the start line than if you were under drinking.
Right.
The question is, do you need to excessively drink compared to what you would normally do, quote unquote, for kind of usual hydration? And again, 4 hours, you can load up on fluid and sodium and achieve the same effect that you can over 2 or 3 days. So I don't think it's necessary to do it for 2 or 3 days. The other thing, and I know I've had a discussion with quite a few dietitians here in Australia working in a variety of different sports, is, if you're loading up on fluid the day before, part of the issue is then you could be up all night having to go to the toilet. And having to pee, multiple times, and then you're interrupting your sleep the night before a race. And I'd probably argue that the interruption in the sleep is going to be more detrimental than any benefit that you might gain from a little bit of extra fluid that's been retained.
Yeah.
So again, that effect of, optimizing your hydration prior to race start could probably be done in the hours before the race rather than having to be done in the days before the race.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I had heard, as well, a wrestler's weight cutting technique with regards to fluid, where they would, I think it was like 3 days before, they would drink, maybe it was even 2 days before, they would drink like loads of water, and then their kidneys the one day before would think that they were going to keep consuming that volume, so would pee out at that rate, and they would actually decrease total body water. Have you heard of that?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. So you're basically trying to suppress the antidiuretic hormone and basically just make the kidneys flush out as much as possible. And then, when you stop the water, that, as you said, the effect persists for a period of time after that. So you can pee out a little bit more. And obviously from that point of view, they're trying to dry themselves out as much as they can from a weight loss point of view. Obviously before a race, that would be counterproductive.
Right. Yes.
But for an endurance type event. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay. So in the days leading up, it doesn't sound like sodium loading or fluid loading is necessary, but you said potentially in the 4 hours before an event. So what would that look like from a sodium and fluid perspective should one potentially consume, or like a range or an average?
Yeah. So the guidelines kind of suggest about 10 mils of fluid per kilogram of body weight. And sorry, it's all in metric.
It's all good.
In those sort of hours before should have you arrive more or less what we call euhydrated, so a normal kind of state of hydration.
Okay.
There are some circumstances where people might want to deliberately what we call hyperhydrate. And that is, we talked last time about sort of very hot, humid conditions where you're going to sweat a lot. It's not necessarily helping you cool, but it's still fluid that you're losing, and therefore, might negatively impact on performance. And, the Tokyo Olympics were probably a good example of that, where it was quite hot and humid as well. And so some countries went and did this hyperhydration approach where they would deliberately load up on a big volume of fluid. So usually a lot more than that, sort of 10 mils per kilo. It could be as high as 20 or 25 mils per kilo. But normally if you do that, what would happen, you'd put all that water into your body, you just pee it out. Right. And in fact, you might actually pee out excessively, that you end up worse off hydration-wise than when you started. So what they do is that they add a lot of sodium to that, or you can use glycerol as well, which was banned by WADA for a period of time, but it no longer is.
Okay.
And so you can add that to the fluid that you're drinking, and basically it helps retain that fluid in the blood, and you don't pee it out. And so you can do that sort of 4 hours before and retain maybe an extra anywhere from maybe 500 mils to maybe 1.2 liters, something like that, within the body, compared to what you could do without that. And so that strategy was employed certainly by some of the Australian athletes before the marathon and the race walk events at the Olympics. So these are events, I guess, where it was predicted to be very hot. The events themselves, they're not ultra endurance events, but they are sort of, 2 hour plus events. But they're also events where at that level, the intensity is so high that the heat production is so high, the sweat rate is going to be really high.
Right.
Because remembering with ultra events, the intensity is not as high. You're not going to sweat as much. And so the ability to replace the sweat loss is actually not as hard as it is in those sort of shorter, but much more intense events like a marathon or like the 50K race walk or something like that. And also in some of those sports, access to fluid might be limited depending on the event, and gut tolerance to drink the volume of fluid needed to maintain hydration. So you haven't got the opportunities to drink, you can't tolerate that volume anyway, or it's going to slow you down. And so it's a competitive disadvantage from that perspective. So they're the situations where maybe that hyperhydration prior to exercise might be helpful, but it's certainly not going to be relevant, I don't think, for the ultra distance stuff.
Okay. And so kind of talking about that, you said the 10 mils per kilo. And so if I do some like fast math here for, we'll say 150-pound person, they're 68 kilos. So then we're looking at 680-ish
Yep.
milliliters. So they're meant to consume that in the 4 hours, or is that per hour?
No, just total. So,
Okay.
I mean, this is in the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines. So they just sort of suggest about that volume of fluid. I think they say about 2 hours before exercise.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's just, I guess, and they sort of suggest about 2 hours before, because it gives you time to get that fluid absorbed into the body. And if you're already well hydrated, you probably didn't need that fluid to give you an opportunity to pee it out before you start. You don't want to be doing this, half an hour before and then on the start line need to pee.
Right. Yeah. And so with that, is there, for that example, 680 mils, should they be adding like 500 milligrams of sodium to that, or is there a rough suggestion?
The guideline doesn't suggest a specific amount for that. I mean, I think if someone's a little bit on the dehydrated side, actually, they probably don't need much, if any, sodium to kind of retain that fluid. If you're well hydrated, then maybe that would be the case.
Okay.
The other thing, and we'll talk a bit about this when we get to the post-exercise stuff, is that if you're consuming that alongside food, the food actually has a pretty strong effect of being able to retain that fluid better as well. Because of not only the sodium in the food, but some of the other nutrients as well can have a similar effect.
Interesting. Cool. And you mentioned glycerol not being banned anymore. What does that taste like?
Yeah, it has a slightly sweet taste to it.
Oh, okay.
It's used in sort of food production in other settings. So, for example, a lot of your reduced fat products have glycerol added because it has sort of a creamy sort of
interesting
texture to it. So, like reduced fat ice creams, for example, to make them less watery, they add that to just make it a bit thicker. And so you can use glycerol for things like that. You usually, certainly here in Australia, if you're going to buy pure glycerol, like in a bottle, you have to buy it from a pharmacy, because if you take too much of it, it has a laxative effect and is actually sold as a laxative.
Oh, shoot. Yeah.
So you got to be careful with it. You don't overdose it. And I guess it's overdosing relative to the water that you're consuming.
I see.
So that's a tricky one. So I'd say if someone's going to go down that path of glycerol loading, you're probably better to get some professional advice around that rather than just trying it yourself at home. The sodium loading is probably a bit easier to do yourself, but again, if you get that wrong, it can be pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, that would make sense. With so the side effects of glycerol overdosing could be laxative effect, which no one wants, added GI issues come race day. Glycerol itself, the molecule, the word ends in OL, and I've always been under the impression that things that end in OL are forms of different types of sugar alcohol, sorbitol, xylitol, and maltol. Is glycerol have some similar? Is that kind of how it can work as a laxative a little bit, or?
Yeah, it basically works because it has an osmotic effect. So that's the reason that you take it for the hyperhydration is what you're trying to do is increase the osmolality in your blood. And so typically in your blood, sodium probably has the biggest influence on the osmolality. So the osmolality is basically just the number of kind of dissolvable particles relative to water. And that's the thing that the body monitors to determine whether you need to pee out fluid or retain it. So if the osmolality is high, so your blood is kind of concentrated, so there's a lack of water relative to all those particles, that's kind of a symbol traditionally of dehydration, and that's what we happen if we exercise and don't drink anything. And so we tend to retain fluid and get more thirsty. But the opposite, if we just drink a heap of plain water, the reason that we pee it out is we drop the osmolality in our blood. There's more water relative to all those particles. So glycerol is just another way of adding some of those osmotically active particles into the blood that's just different to sodium. But because it is osmotically active in the blood, it can also be osmotically active in the gut. And so if you put a big amount of that into your gut without much fluid there, you have very high osmolality within your gut that's going to draw water into the gut.
I see.
And that's going to cause that sort of laxative effect.
That makes sense. So should we move on to, well, I guess one more question with regards to pre, which is just in relation to, I know we talked about how maybe there's not necessarily a need for fluid loading or sodium loading, But would there be any different suggestions of how one might want to alter their pre-planning hydration or fluid or electrolyte needs for racing at altitude?
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, you might lose a little bit more fluid at altitude, but I guess the flip side to that is depending on where you are at altitude, it might be a lot colder as well.
Yeah.
And so you may not be actually sweating as much. So yeah, I think it has to be done on a very individual basis and really assessing, well, how much fluid am I actually losing? Is it more than normal, or is it the same, or in some cases a bit less than normal? So just, I guess, taking that as it comes from a fluid point of view, as you would do for any other form of training or racing, is probably how I would deal with that. Just being aware that, I guess, that it may be at altitude, you might lose a little bit more fluid compared to the same conditions at sea level.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. So we can dive into post training or racing now too. So, how would one, if we think about a longer duration, 3+ hour event, we can even, if you want to give specific examples from any research to ultra or anything like that, how should one think about replenishing, or if they need to replenish, or what would be some signs that they need fluids after an event?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I think about when I think about post-exercise is that overall sort of recovery picture. And obviously fluid and rehydration is part of that picture, alongside sort of refueling with carbohydrate. And so those might interact in terms of having carbs in your fluids. And then also that sort of recovering aspect of, protein and muscle remodeling and all that kind of thing. And so I guess the first thing I would think about from a recovery point of view is, what is my sort of recovery window that I have? In other words, if I'm finishing a training session today and I've got another hard training session tomorrow morning, and I've only got a 12, 15 hour window or something because I've trained this afternoon, I'm going to go in the morning, then obviously, you need to be a little bit more aggressive there to achieve all of those goals in terms of refueling, rehydrating, etc. The flip side to that, though, is you finish your marathon, and I get this all the time, that people say, oh, what do I need to do to recover after my marathon? And I say, well, when are you going to train again? I don't know, I'm going to have a week off or 2 weeks off. I was like, oh, well, why do you care about recovery? Like, you're not training tomorrow, so what does it really matter? So from that point of view, I think that context is important, is that, if you finish a one-off endurance event like that and you're not training, or it's not a multi-day event or anything like that, then you may not really need to worry that much about it, to be honest. Obviously, a different story if you're doing a multi-day event and you've got to recover for the next day. So I guess if we take that sort of assumption, either because it's multiple days of training or like a multi-stage race or something like that, that's when I guess that rehydration is going to become more important. So as a general rule, if we start off with the fluid side of things, and then we can talk about maybe sodium and other factors around the fluid retention. I guess from a fluid point of view, the guidelines suggest that you should replace about 120 to 150% of what you lost, or your deficit at the end of exercise, basically to restore your fluid back to what it was pre-exercise. And the reason that it's not 100%, it's more than that, is because there's an assumption that, when you finish exercise, you're still going to be sweating a bit as your body temperature sort of comes back down in the hour or so after exercise. So actually your deficit, if you did nothing, will be greater, maybe 1 or 2 hours after exercise than it was immediately at the end of exercise. So that's kind of the rationale for that. And also just because you're going to pee out a little bit of that fluid.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the volume. And then I guess the time frame that's kind of suggested over is maybe the first sort of 4-ish hours post-exercise. But again, that's really only if you need to, rehydrate on quite a tight time frame. 12, 15 hours, something like that. If someone's got sort of 24 hours or more to, sort of restore their hydration before the next challenging training session or race or something like that, then probably for most people, they can just ad-lib, like just drink whatever they want as they feel like it, and their thirst will get them back to where they need to go. Their kidneys will help with that, because they'll, if you're dehydrated, they're obviously going to conserve fluid. You're not going to pee out as much. So, I think, on those longer time frames, usually your kidneys are going to sort things out for you. But on those shorter time frames, maybe you do need to be a little bit more aggressive with it.
Okay. And talking about kind of replacing 120 to 150% of losses, to know that one would have had to weigh themselves before and after the session, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
And out of curiosity, do you see many athletes weigh themselves on race day?
No.
Okay.
Not many.
That's what I thought. Yeah, that's what I thought. So in that situation, kind of as you mentioned, if it's the key event. So maybe they do have a rest week after, and that's where the individual could rely more on listening to their thirst cues and stuff like that, versus if it was maybe a big build week and they're having multiple training sessions, then paying attention and weighing pre and post could be a tool to help them with performance and rehydration that week.
Yeah. And I think for the majority of athletes that are, unless you're doing those sort of multi-stage events, for most people that are doing the one-off, the triathlon or the marathon or ultra race or whatever it is, then it's probably actually going to be more in the day-to-day of training where this becomes more important than it does after a race. Because again, after a race, you're probably not going to go out and do quality training in the days afterwards anyway, as you said. So it's probably more the training, and that's maybe where you would be more likely to be able to weigh yourself before and after, because you're leaving from home, you're coming back to home, you've got everything there, as opposed to you may be in another state or another country for a race or something.
Yeah, awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a really helpful tool, the kind of replacement. So I guess to the other piece, so 100 to help kind of our listeners, when we say 120 to 150% of loss, typically people are going to be getting a pound or a kilogram metric if they're hopping on the scale. So how does one translate that into either milliliters or ounces?
So we make an assumption that a liter of water is 1 kilogram. Okay. So you base on that. So and as you said, it's the deficit at the end of exercise, not the total sweat loss. Like I might have sweated 2 liters in my session, but I've only got a half kilo deficit. So it's only the 150% of the half kilo deficit, not the 2 liter loss. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Awesome. That's really helpful. So you mentioned we covered our fluid loss. What about electrolyte, sodium, stuff like that?
Yeah. This is another interesting one. And there's a couple of different aspects to this. One is around sort of the absorption and retention of the fluid that we're drinking. So it's more about sodium as a tool to retain that fluid and the rehydration piece. And then the other one is, I guess, restoring sort of the total amount of sodium within the body as well. So 2 different factors, I guess, here that are quite different to look at. So one is sort of looking at, okay, well, how much sodium did I lose during the session? And does that need replacing, versus I need a certain amount of sodium to retain that fluid, kind of like the pre-exercise aspect of it as well. Yeah. So I guess if we start with the fluid absorption and retention, because that's the area that's probably received the most sort of research attention. And so there are a lot of guidelines out there that suggest, they generally don't quantify this to a significant extent, but that you should deliberately sort of up your electrolyte and particularly your sodium intake post-exercise, have salty foods to help retain that fluid, that sort of thing. Most of that research, and probably the end point of that research, I'd say, is some work that happened in the UK. That they came up with a thing called the Beverage Hydration Index. So basically what they did is they looked at all sorts of different fluids that you could consume, from plain water, sports drinks, fruit juice, milk. I think there was a few other things as well from memory. And what basically they set up this situation where people exercise, they finish, they give them a set volume of this, whatever drink it is, and then they measure how much urine they produce in that time afterwards. So the idea is that you're drinking the same amount of each drink, the less urine you produce, the more of that fluid you've retained. Gotcha. And so it has a better rehydration, if you like, score. And so things like milk score really well, higher sodium drinks score well as well. Or things just with lots of like nutrient dense drinks generally score pretty well as a general rule. The sports drinks actually don't tend to score that much better than plain water, a little bit, but not massively. Interesting. That's probably because the sodium content is not that high in them. Yeah. But I guess the problem with that kind of research is, firstly, it's studying individual drinks in isolation. So it assumes that you're choosing this drink or this drink or this drink, but you're never going to have a combination of those.
Right.
The other thing is it doesn't add food into the mix. Whereas, normally after exercise, you're probably going to eat a meal or some snacks or something within the first hour or two after exercise during this same kind of period. So a group of researchers here in Australia, up in Queensland, Ben Desborough, Chris Irwin, and some of the students that they've had through their lab have done some of that work where they've actually taken different drinks, but then added ad libitum food intake in there and let people choose sort of the snacks or meals that they'd want to have after exercise as well. And what they see there is that when you add food into the equation, the type of beverage makes absolutely no difference.
Oh, interesting.
Because all of those nutrients in the food have that same effect of retaining that fluid. So it doesn't matter whether you drink water, sports drink, milk, juice, whatever, as long as you're consuming food alongside it, it probably makes no difference at all. And I guess their point there is that, you should choose the fluid based on your individual goals. So if you're someone who, maybe weight loss is a goal, for example, then maybe water is going to be a better choice because you're still going to retain just as much, but you're not going to get all those calories. And what they found was that when you add food into the mix, you end up consuming more energy overall if you then have calories in your drinks as well as obviously what you're getting from the food, and there's no compensation for that. But there's other athletes where they have very high energy needs and they need more calories. So in fact, that could be strategic, that you're choosing a beverage that does have more carbohydrate, more calories in it alongside the food. It's not necessarily to retain that fluid better, it's just because you need to meet your energy needs by combining those two things together. So from a fluid retention point of view, I think in the real world where people are having maybe multiple different types of drinks, having food in the mix, actually that whole beverage hydration index stuff, it's interesting, but it's probably a bit academic because it's very rare in the real world that you would act in that way, I suppose.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes me, we also get the question all the time, which I'm sure you do as well, talking about cramping and people potentially getting a cramp during their race or just after they finish, and potentially blaming that on lack of hydration or needing more electrolytes. What would be your thoughts or statement on that?
Yeah, cramping's been an interesting one. I was just thinking we didn't get to the sodium replacement. Do you want to do that first and then come back to the cramping?
Thank you.
Yes. So with the sodium replacement, as opposed to it being a tool for fluid retention, if you go out and you lose a certain amount of sodium during your event, you've probably replaced some of that, but probably not all of it. And as we spoke about last time, you don't need to replace all of it anyway. Do you then need to go out and replace that deficit before tomorrow's training session or next stage of a race or something like that? It's an interesting question. I don't think we have a great answer to that yet because it hasn't really been studied very much. I've just finished. I'm doing the analysis on it at the moment. We did a study here. We started it in 2019 and then COVID's kind of got in the way of it. But we just finished this year. People running for 5 hours in the lab in 30 degrees Celsius. I can't remember what that is in Fahrenheit, but I don't know, about 90 maybe.
Yeah, sounds brutal.
Not fun.
So
COVID aside, it was a pretty difficult study to recruit people for because it's not pleasant on 5 hours on a treadmill. But that study, we actually gave them either sodium in capsules or placebo capsules throughout. So basically we sweat tested them, a week or two prior in the same conditions, and then made up the capsules to the milligram of what the loss was in the prior session. So we individualized the sodium replacement for the participants, and then they took that over the 5 hours, or they did a second trial where they had just placebo capsules. So in one case, they've essentially replaced all of their sodium losses, and in the other one, they haven't replaced any sodium at all during exercise. And one thing with this is we then followed them for the 24 hours after as well, as the lead up to that. So again, they had to collect all their pee in that 24 hours afterwards, and then we measured kind of where they sort of looked at from a hydration perspective when they presented back to the lab the next morning. And we allowed them to drink as much or as little fluid as they wanted, but we tracked that. So we gave them to them in bottles and weighed it before and after, so we could see how much fluid they actually chose to drink, whether they were in a sodium deficit or not. And yeah, it was really interesting. We haven't published this yet. One of the things that we did see, though, and this is kind of assumed in the literature, but there are very few studies that have looked at it, is in that post-exercise period, if you've accumulated a big sodium deficit during the exercise, the kidneys start to compensate for that in that 24 hours. And so the amount of sodium in the urine after the placebo trial, where they didn't, they racked up a big sodium deficit, was minuscule. Like I remember putting the first few samples on the machine and testing it and going, what's wrong with the machine? Like, this can't be right. These values are so low.
Wow.
But it was just consistent. It happened in everyone. And while, like, in terms of the sodium intake in that post-exercise period, it was pretty much just mirrored what they were doing in the days prior to exercise. So we gave them all the food to control their sodium intake, and we just gave them kind of a standard amount that most people would eat day to day. And so when they presented the next morning and we looked at all their urine and their sodium loss through their urine, and then all their sodium intake from the food that we gave them, they were still in a sodium deficit, that placebo group, but it wasn't nearly as big a deficit as you might expect, because the kidneys have done a lot of that compensation. So yes, you might need to up your sodium intake a little bit depending on how big that deficit was, but your kidneys are going to take care of a large portion of that without you having to go out and deliberately eat a whole bunch of sodium in those hours after exercise. Now, obviously, that was an extreme example, was 5 hours with literally zero sodium intake against whatever your sweat losses were. So that's pretty unlikely in the real world that would actually happen. Even if you're not deliberately having a specific amount of sodium, just by having drinks and gels and food and things, you're going to get some sodium during exercise anyway. So I think, the deficit probably wouldn't be that big in most cases. And so the kidneys might account for that, or you might have a higher sodium intake afterwards just in your day-to-day diet, and it wouldn't be such a big deal. Or it could be after like a 100-mile ultra marathon. That would obviously be potentially a much bigger sodium deficit, but again, you're probably not going to go out and do another 100-mile within the next couple of days. So again, your kidneys will restore that. It might just take 2 or 3 days to get there. 24 hours just wasn't quite enough.
Yeah. The body is really incredible.
Oh yeah.
To maintain, keep us alive and maintain some level of homeostasis as best as it can. Did you, with your group, out of curiosity, where you did the very low or no sodium versus those with the sodium in the capsules, monitor potentially like cravings or desire for salty foods?
During exercise, we did, yeah.
Okay,
and we didn't really see anything there.
Oh, interesting.
Like maybe the salt craving went up a tiny bit over the course of 5 hours, but it was pretty small, that it didn't really seem to change.
Okay.
One group or the other. I wonder whether part of that is because it was in capsules, so they couldn't taste it in their mouth. Yeah. And that was deliberate, because we didn't want them to know which trial they were in. But obviously that might work out a little bit differently usually when you've got the flavor of it there.
Right. Get something firing in the brain with that taste perception of the salt, maybe.
Yeah.
It makes me think, I've, spoke with clients where they will maybe finish a session and then they just want like salty something, but of course, sometimes the foods that are also very salty are also very energy dense. So it could be partly that, but like if someone is craving like pickles, something that's not super energy dense, but is quite sodium rich, is that an indicator that maybe their body needs sodium, or does this person just have a pickle addiction?
I don't think we know, really, to be honest. There's a little bit of literature around salt craving, and it's pretty inconclusive. So certainly it's not glaringly obvious from the studies that have looked at this that you get a big sodium deficit during exercise and you'll suddenly crave a whole bunch of salt, or that if you take a whole bunch of salt during exercise that you won't either. So I think maybe in some people that effect is there, but it doesn't come out when you look at groups of people in research for whatever reason. Maybe it's just the way that the studies are designed, it's not teasing it out properly, whether the effect's not there, whether the effect is different in different people. I don't think we really know that yet.
Interesting. So kind of jumping back to fluids, is someone could plan to replenish in that 4 hours if they have another training session coming up shortly after or quickly in the next day. Maybe from a sodium perspective, you're saying that will kind of self-regulate if they have a training session and not necessarily a specific need to include additional sodium in that rehydration thing, and the foods, like you're saying, will help pull that fluid in.
Yeah, look, I think as long as the sodium deficit is not enormous, then yeah, the kidneys will be able to compensate for a moderate kind of sodium deficit. And obviously, the bigger the sodium deficit, the longer the kidneys will take to be able to compensate for that. That said, I don't think there's any harm in having like salty foods in that period after exercise. I mean, the kidneys will just get rid of any excess that it doesn't need. So yeah, I don't think there's any harm in that, but it's probably not something you deliberately have to go out and do if you don't want to or feel like it. But if you feel like having really salty foods post-exercise, there's no harm in that either.
Yeah. Awesome. That's super helpful. So should we move on to the cramp question, talking about sodium deficits? What's the truth or myth, but feel free to bust the myth here for us.
Yeah, cramping's a really interesting story. And I think part of the reason it's an interesting story is it's incredibly difficult to study. Obviously, cramping is, everyone knows cramping is pretty unpredictable. You don't necessarily see it coming on. Some days you cramp and other days you don't. Some people cramp a lot. Some people hardly ever cramp at all. And so it's not like you can just bring people into the lab and say, okay, well, when I count to 3, I just want you to cramp for me, and I can measure that, and then we can see what goes on. Like, it's not going to work like that. So it does make it really difficult to study, which I think historically is probably why it hasn't been studied all that much. And I think probably the other reason it hasn't been studied is just because, it's not life-threatening. So from a research funding point of view, it hasn't received a kind of the level of priority that other areas might. DNFing a race, well, that's not great for the individual, but it's not really a societal problem that needs solving in the same way that, hyponatremia that puts people in hospital or potentially kills them, or, major gut issues or something like that might be, more severe. So, I think there's a few reasons why it hasn't been studied a lot. I guess historically, the link with sort of salt or sodium and cramping goes back to kind of the 1920s and 30s. And there was a lot of research in sort of occupational health at that time. Some of the sort of the more famous studies were people building the Hoover Dam, for example, and other kind of big infrastructure projects at that time, where they would get, obviously a lot of it was pretty manual labor at that time. And so cramping was pretty common. And there were stories of, adding salt to people's drinks or even into their beer. And that actually had an effect on, reducing the severity, not necessarily completely eliminating, but reducing the severity of cramping. And I think that's where a lot of the story of sodium and cramp sort of first came from.
Interesting.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, when people have gone back recently and kind of reviewed all of that information, is that what they also found is that a lot of those people were hyponatremic. So, in fact, the sodium there was not necessarily, offsetting a sodium deficit, so to speak. It was probably just making them less hyponatremic. And maybe, and we know with hyponatremia, cramping is one of the symptoms of that. So it's an interesting one, whether it's about the blood sodium concentration and preventing that falling too low, which drives fluid into your cells and expands them. And maybe there's something in there mechanistically, we don't really know yet, rather than it being sort of a purely a sodium deficit. What we do know is that there's a lot of studies now where people have gone to races, measured, how hydrated or not people are at the finish. So like, did they gain or lose weight during exercise? Whether is there any association between that and cramping? And it doesn't seem to be. The people who lose the most fluid are no more prone to cramping than the people who don't. The blood sodium concentration, there's not a great correlation there, although you could argue, unless you're seeing both extremes of over and under, maybe that's not being captured. So it's an interesting one. And so that was kind of the predominant theory for a long time. There was another theory that came along sort of from the late 1990s, that it was more about muscle fatigue, the neuromuscular fatigue impacting on the nervous system, which obviously the nervous system has to be involved in cramping because that's what controls the contraction of the muscles that are then going on to cramp. And then there was a bit of sort of tit for tat between those kind of two theories over a period of time. And it's sort of just in the last couple of years actually come together now into this kind of unified theory, which is kind of nice to see. And the theory is kind of that there are multiple factors that could contribute to cramping. The common thing is obviously something's going wrong with the nervous system that's then firing off the contraction of the muscle. So it's just then, well, what's causing that in the nervous system? And so the theory now is that there's two things. One, the actual function of the nervous system could be altered in some way. And there's a whole bunch of theories about why that could be.
Interesting.
Genetics, certain medications, certain medical conditions, but even things like the stress response to exercise, because obviously when we get a stress response with various hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, all that kind of stuff, that interacts with the nervous system. And so whether it's the stress response to the exercise, so the intensity, body temperature, dehydration maybe, but also things like psychological stress, which I know is an area that some researchers are starting to look into now. And then the other aspect of it is feedback from the muscle to the nervous system. So we know that one of the biggest risk factors for cramping is repetitive contractions of the muscle in a shortened position. And it seems to be that there's little bits and pieces within the muscle that feed back to the nervous system. And that's kind of where that neuromuscular fatigue kind of theory of cramping came. Sort of was centered around that. So there's an element there of, you know, the biomechanical aspect. So if it's on a bike, like your bike fit, for example, might have a role to play, or running, like running shoes or running technique and that kind of thing. Fatigue might even be, you know, like lack of carbohydrate, lack of fuel. And it's an area that might be important there as well. We know that muscle temperature, muscle injury and damage may play a role as well. So I guess the point I'm making here is there's a whole lot of different factors that are going on here, and sodium is just one tiny part of that.
Yes.
And so that kind of unified theory now suggests that, you know, the factors are different in different athletes. It can be more than one factor going on at the same time, which is why, you know, usually people try and eliminate one factor at a time kind of scientifically to try and figure out, is this the cause of my cramps? No. Was this the cause of my cramps? But the problem is, because there's multiple things going on, you just eliminate one, you don't necessarily figure out what's going on. The only way to do it is to eliminate or minimize everything and then gradually put things back in one at a time to figure that out. So yeah, it's a real challenge, but I guess that the upshot of all of that is probably different people have different risk factors for cramping. They all come together. Eventually they reach a threshold where they all add up to the point where the nervous system is affected and the cramping starts. And so there's a really nice paper from Kevin Miller, he's the first author. He's at the University of Texas State University, I think. He's just moved down there recently. And I really like the article. It has a bit of a diagram that explains what I've just explained, but it also has this really nice questionnaire in there that sort of goes through kind of identifying what are the risk factors for an individual. And then from there, okay, well, I think this and this are relevant to you. These ones maybe we don't need to worry about. But let's focus on what can we control within these risk factors to try and reduce your risk of cramping.
That's great.
And I think I'll just finish on, you know, one of the most fundamental things that you see time and time again with cramping when you talk to people is it happens on race day, but it never happens in training. And so the question becomes, well, what's fundamentally different on race day to what it is in training? And that could be different for different people. You know, some people will say, well, I know intensity and duration and, you know, fatigue and all those things might be factors, so I try and replicate that in training, but I still can't replicate the cramping. And so my suspicion is it could be that psychological stress element to that, you know, just your mindset, your psychology, you know, your nervous system is fundamentally different on race day than what it is in training, because it's a completely different scenario.
Fascinating.
And the stakes are different.
Wow. That is very interesting. The cramp thing is, like you're saying, it's hard to study that, right? So I think that is a tricky one to nail down for, I mean, many clients and athletes, but Yeah, I think that's a helpful information for many people, all areas we covered today, pre and post. And then kind of one final thing I just wanted to finish with before, and being mindful of your time here, lots of tech devices coming out, testing sodium or fluid losses, sodium concentration. And I know in our first podcast, part 1, listeners go back and listen to it. Alan broke down when potentially utilizing sodium and if there's even an effect on performance. I won't give it away, but like, you should go back and listen to that. And he kind of broke that down for us. And I'm curious, Alan, what your thoughts are with these devices. And do you think is it a useful tool? Is it, we're unsure because we don't have enough research right now? What are your thoughts of these devices?
Yeah, well, I think without giving away the previous episode, I think, the use case for something like this would be more ultra endurance sports, because that's where, the extent to which you need to replace your fluid losses is the greatest, and the greater percentage of your fluid loss that you have to replace, that's when sodium comes into the picture as potentially being important in terms of having a specific amount during exercise, which is what that testing is really there to help you kind of figure out. I guess the first thing with all the various wearable devices is we need to be careful before we jump in, like even before we take the information from it, is the information actually valid?
Right.
And so what I mean by that is, if you do sort of a traditional sort of lab method and then compare it to the wearable, are you going to get the same result? And so whenever a new sort of wearable device comes out and people ask me, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? The first thing I do is go and look at, well, what validation studies have been done to actually show that the result that you get from this wearable device is comparable to, whatever we've used in the past, or what's considered kind of the reference method for that. And so what you tend to see with a lot of these devices is you go to their websites and there's nothing there. Now they might say, scientifically proven or whatever it is. It's like, okay, well, where's the science? And so, I'm always a little bit, and it's not to say that they're not valid. They might be really good, but until that information is available, you have no way of knowing that. And so you just have to, I guess, be a little bit careful from that perspective. So that's a tricky one. And I think one of the things that's changed over the years is, in the past, these methods came out of university labs, and that's a relatively slow process because you've got to get ethics approval, do your study, analyze it, get it published. That's a long, sort of slow process. But now with the consumable wearable market, there's a new product every month almost, and every product's got their next generation, 12 months later. It's like you can't even turn around a validation study within 12 months. So by the time you validated the product, the next generation's already on the market.
Wow.
And so that makes it really challenging to kind of keep up to date with all these different wearable devices. But in terms of, like, let's assume that it is valid and we're getting the data from that. I think, the wearable devices have enormous potential in this area. Obviously, going and doing a patch test is pretty cumbersome. To do it well, you need sort of specific skills and lab equipment and that kind of thing. So if you can do that without any of those things, that'd be fantastic. I know we talked a bit off air before about some of these devices potentially being able to give you that data in real time as well. So you don't have to wait a week to find out, or a few hours after you've stopped. You can actually find out what's happening in the moment. That would be interesting. I think it's going to be the next challenge, which is, I think this happens with all wearables, not just these ones, is, okay, you've got all this data now, what do you do with it? And that's often where the tech companies stop, and everyone's kind of left with this quandary of, I've got this data, but what does it mean? How do I use it? Is it actually going to add value to what I'm doing? Because if it's not adding value, well, why are you going to all the effort of collecting it in the first place? And anyone who's got all sorts of devices and they upload their data to whatever kind of platform, the majority of that data just sits there and gathers dust virtually, and never really sees the light of day or has actionable information from it. So I think that's going to be the next challenge, is that if we can nail down the real-time measurement of sodium and fluid losses during exercise, because some of them claim to be able to measure sweat rate in real time as well. Even if it can do those things, how do we translate that into actionable information to say, okay, I'm going to skip that salt capsule, or I'm going to have plain water instead of my electrolyte drink this time, or actually I need more electrolytes and now I'm falling behind or whatever. That's going to be the next part, is that practical translation. And unfortunately, the tech companies, that's not really their interest. Their interest is in building the product to give you the information, not in the how you action that information. So it's then going to take someone else to come along and actually, I think, do a lot of that legwork, unless there's companies that have an interest in it, because traditionally I don't think they do a lot. As long as people are buying the products, what they do with the information at the end is up to the individual.
Right. Yes. And out of curiosity, and you don't have to like say any names if there aren't any, but are there any products that are available to the public, or a gold standard, maybe lab version that the public could access, that you recommend for validity?
It's tricky because it's going to be different in different places. So a lot of that is sort of individual labs that are set up to do it. There are some companies that send out like the sweat patches in like a mail order type thing, where you get it in the mail, you do the patch, you stick it in the mail and send it back. Those can, if they're done well, they can be useful. There's some good evidence that, once a sweat patch is captured and stored well, it can last a week or more. You can send it on a plane around the country and back again, and the result is still okay. So there has been some validation of that. It's even if it's like 30 degrees Celsius or below freezing, they seem to be okay. So that's okay. I know, just to give an example, the Australian Institute of Sport used to do this kind of testing, where people would go and then send them in, and then they had the equipment at the AIS where they could do the actual analysis. What they actually stopped doing that several years ago now, because they found a few different things. One, people didn't put the patches on for long enough, so when they went to centrifuge it and get the sweat out of it, there was nothing there, or not enough to analyze. Or they, for some of the team sport athletes, they were getting patches back that had like blades of grass or bits of dirt stuck in the patch and things, contaminating them. And so
that's tricky.
it obviously still has to be done well to do that. So I think ultimately, if you're not sure about that, you're better to get it done in a lab that can do that. But it's not going to be, there's not like one company that you can go to do that in every state or country it's going. So it's hard for me to say, go here, these guys are good or not, because they're all little individual, either university labs or private labs.
So maybe for listeners, they could check their university labs to see if they offer sweat testing and stuff like that as a resource. Or
there's the like Gatorade have the mail out patches where it actually tries to analyze on the patch, and they've done a lot of work, I think, to validate that. It's not something I've followed, because I've got we do our own setup here, so I haven't followed it in detail yet. And then obviously the wearables, as I said, we just need to know what the validity of those is before we sort of jump headfirst into those.
So you're saying you do in-house sweat testing in your lab where you are?
Well, we use it in studies, so for research participants. We have at times offered it for individuals who want to know, like we have a nutrition and exercise clinic there. The main focus of that is a gut assessment, which is a completely different topic, because they basically came up with the protocol that's used. And so people with gut issues can come into the lab at Monash and actually figure out the root cause of their gut issues, and then put strategies in place. But sometimes, depending on the person, they might come in for that, and we'll put some sweat patches on as part of that. But you've got to be in there for a fairly long period of time to collect the sweat. So it's, you're paying for someone's time. It's not cheap, unfortunately.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. Awesome. Well, we went over time again.
That's all right.
We love talking to you. We super appreciate your time again here for part 2, Alan. This was always fascinating and super helpful. I think we got a lot of great takeaways for our listeners. So thank you again for your time. And where can people find you?
Yeah, so a couple of different places. If you want to contact me by email, universities have this thing where they just publish all their staff emails online. You don't get a say in it, it's just there. So if you Google my name and Monash University, you'll find my researcher page, and that'll have my email address. Perfect. Same if you want to find any other academic in the world, it pretty much works the same everywhere. The other one, I guess, on Twitter, So my private practice is called Next Level Nutrition. So the Twitter handle is Next, so NEXTLVLNUT. I have the same one on Instagram, but I don't really use it. Okay. And then I've got my own podcast, which has its own Twitter handle and Instagram handle, which is called The Long Munch. So that's the handle for that on both Instagram and Twitter.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you guys. Well, thank you, Alan and Nia, for Nia's in the background here, editing, taking notes. We will try and link to that article you mentioned at the end. Tiller was the last name. Was it?
Oh, Kevin Miller.
Okay. Kevin Miller. Yeah. We'll make sure we link that. And then, this was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah, no problem.